Ukraine, Russia was bled to death, losing nearly 2 million men, while in northern Italy, 500,000 Italians died against the glittering background of the Alps. Looking at a whale close up, we can see only a bit of it at a time. What English speakers remember, when we look back at the war, are the trenches and no man's land, a bleak landscape of misery seldom surpassed in history. Perhaps ironically, the First World War is to a remarkable extent defined in our minds by its poetry. This is not unique, of course. Most of what we know about the Trojan War we get from reading the Iliad and the Odyssey. But in modern times, this has seldom been the case. We live in an age when poetry no longer commands a wide readership or even much respect, and when poets are seldom celebrities. Footnote: Sylvia Plath is an exception, but it is as much her failed marriage, depression, and suicide that make her famous as her poetry, except perhaps for Daddy. End footnote. The soldier poets of the First World War lived at the tail end of the Victorian and Edwardian age, when there was still a substantial readership for poetry. Tennyson and Kipling were national figures, and poetry mattered to people in a way it no longer does to us. It had a place in popular culture. It could still capture the attention, portray current or recent events, and touch people's emotions, as did Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade and Sir Henry Newbolt's Vitae Lampada. The rising rate of literacy had increased the number of people who read poetry, rather than smothering it as some had feared it would, bestowing on Rupert Brooke, for instance, the equivalent of rock stardom today. Perhaps never before was a war more tightly censored than the First World War. From the very first, as the casualty lists climbed swiftly to previously unimaginable numbers, 250,000 French and British casualties and over 250,000 Germans in the first month. Every effort was made to protect the general public from the brutal reality of the fighting. At the time, still cameras were bulky and unwieldy. The first Leica would not go on sale until 1925, and motion picture cameras were even more so. Photos from the front line, when they appeared at all, were generally staged to produce a heroic image, free from corpses and the wounded. Newspaper communiques were pitched at a high level of optimism. Mail from the front was even more strictly censored, which, when combined with the natural tendency of the British to play down the horror of war and keep smiling through, in the words of a popular song, effectively prevented the public from getting any sense that the war was descending into a bloody nightmare unparalleled in history. Curiously, the one thing that was not censored or repressed was poetry. Book and magazine publishers to a certain degree censored themselves for fear of being prosecuted under the Defense of the Realm Act, DORA, or of having their supply of paper cut off. The meteoric rise to fame of Rupert Brooke, one of whose war poems was read aloud from the pulpit by the Dean of St. Paul's in 1915, then was published in the Times and the Times Literary Supplement, showed that poetry could reach a much larger readership than had hitherto been thought possible, and that a poet might become a national hero. It helped that Brooke was not only talented but glamorous, and that his war poems favored the war. Nobody considered that celebrated soldier poets might one day turn against the war. In any case, by 1917, poetry had become a chink through which civilians might glimpse the sheer horror of the Western Front. The men who wrote it were writing out of their own experience. They were soldiers and poets. Indeed, some of them composed their poems in the trenches under fire, and not a few of them were decorated heroes. Many were wounded or killed in battle. What gave their poems their enormous impact was their authenticity, and in some cases, their brutal realism. The official war artists, who were organized as a group by the Ministry of Information and were given officer status, watched and painted the war from a distance. But the soldier poets fought, killed, and sometimes died in battle. They made no attempt to prettify the war for home consumption. On the contrary, they wrote with anger and disgust, and sometimes with a savage contempt for their generals and politicians. Looking at their often intertwined lives is one way to understand how the initial enthusiasm for the war